Welcome again to yet another wonderful and exciting episode of Global Conversations. You're joining us on an excellent and illuminating conversation with Katherine Wu, an expert in cultural intelligence. Katherine's work encompasses much more than her role as a lecturer and director of executive programs at the Center for Leadership and Cultural Intelligence. She beautifully intertwines her professional work with a heartfelt passion, consistently inspiring us through engaging and insightful posts on LinkedIn. Trust me, they are amazing, especially if you're up at 8 o'clock Eastern time, evening Eastern time, where you actually get to see her, get to read her posts, but they are thought-provoking and exciting on both cultural intelligence and as well if you catch her on previous episodes of our CQ and Love podcast. I was particularly moved by Katherine's unique perspectives on enhancing global collaborations through nuanced understanding of cultural diversity and an idea that has inspired countless professionals worldwide. Her posts are an imperative need for cultural intelligence in our interconnected world, especially nowadays, and provide actionable insights for individuals and institutional advances. As I dig into this dialogue with Katherine, I assure you it won't be a standard question and answer session between her and I. Our conversation aims to be casual, yet insightful, jovial, and thought-provoking. And today's conversation with Katherine is designed to be relaxing, engaged, filled with valuable takeaways for our listeners. So, Katherine, thank you very much for doing this, and I really appreciate having you today.
Thank you very much, André. I'm very, very excited to meet you and talk to you today.
Yeah, I mean it's been a while, and like I've mentioned to you, for several times, is that I've been following your posts and your exchanges and whatnot, and all your education in cultural intelligence. You're an expert in this field, and a lot of people follow what you have to say, and myself included. And I've learned a lot about you and who you are, what you bring to the profession, even as someone who's working in equity, diversity, inclusion. So I want to get a little bit more of an insight into who you are.
Okay.
How you started, your career path, and how did you find your calling into cultural intelligence?
Oh, how did I find my calling? Well, when I was 13 years old, actually, no, I start before that. I grew up in a village in the south of France, and I like to say my village, there's no traffic light, only one main road, the kind of place that fewer and fewer people in this world, have the chance to grow up in. But when I was growing up in this village, it's one of those places where there is no cultural diversity. Everybody is white, everybody speaks French. And I remember growing up with this idea that even, we learn English in school, for example, but I even thinking that one day I would be able to speak English fluently, have this kind of conversation with you is something that I never thought would ever be possible. I couldn't even dream it because to me it was not even something that I could ever do. But somehow when I was 13 years old, one summer, I met this friend. Her name was Aurore. Uh, and she was on holiday in my village visiting her grandmother, and she lived in a family of expats. So her dad worked for a big engineering company, and she was my age, but she has spent most of her life living in Niger and in Mallorca and in Russia. And she was telling me these amazing stories of growing up in those places, where everything is different, the food, the lifestyle. So as a 13 years old who's never stepped a foot outside of that village, for me, I started to feel fascinated by the world out there and looking for any opportunities I had to go out. Um, so when fast forward many years, not many years, several years, I went to business school, and when I was in business school, I chose business because I thought, okay, you want to have an international career, then what is most likely to get me there is like business. I didn't know anything about business. No one in my family is in business.
Yeah.
But still, I went there and I had this chance to go to to England because my thought was, okay, if I want to have an international career,
Mhm.
um, I need to speak English. And so, but I couldn't speak English well. So I say, I look at all the options I had to go abroad with my school, and I've picked the one exchange program that did not require an English test because I didn't think I could pass that test. So I
Mhm.
just picked the one school, and it turned out to be a 1 year program, and it was the yeah, it was the best experience. I say, this is the experience that changed my life, that set me on this trajectory, on this path. It did it in two ways. One is by pushing me really out of my comfort zone. So the first night I was there, I remember arriving in England, and within 3 hours I had been in England. I called my mom and I was crying. I made a mistake. I don't want to be here. I want to go home. But of course, she was not going to let me go back. And it was my first experience of a true culture shock. You arrive in a place, everything is so different.
Mhm.
But that day, my German roommate arrived and she invited me to go out for drinks. And I remember walking to the student union bar, and I hear a voice behind me, and is this French student. He's from my school. His name is Youssef. I remember him very well. And he's like, "Hey, Catherine, ça va? Where are you sitting with?" And I show him this table on the side, and you sat this small table, 5, 6 international students there. And then he said, "Hey, do you want to join us?" And he pointed in the other direction. And in the other direction, there's this big table, like 12, 15 French people. And I like to
Mhm.
joke that, we hadn't been in England for a day, that they had all found each other already, right? Um, but it's this, and at that moment, I had a choice to make, right? It's like, on the one hand, I can go to my people and I can continue to feel comfortable and speak my language and all of that. Or I can go the other way with international students. Um, and I remember at that point, my goal is very clear. I went to England to learn English. And so I didn't
Mhm.
even think twice, right? I went with them. But that really set me on that journey, is like, because after that, I took a class in a cultural psychology, where I got exposed to the model of cultural values, okay,
Mhm.
power,
Mhm.
distance, individualism,
Yeah.
collectivism. If you're an interculturalist, this is the basics, right? But for me, I
Mhm.
remember the first time I heard about those concepts, I really, I don't remember any of my classes when I was a student in university, but this is the one class I still remember. My mind was blown, you know. And from that day on, I just wanted to study that, cultural differences, because I could feel them in my life, with my German friends,
Mhm.
my friends, they were from Canada, from Poland, all over Europe. Um, and I could already feel that difference. And so when I returned to France, because I could speak English by then, not so well, but enough, that gives me the courage to sign up for an international business class that was all in English. And in that
Mhm.
class, I was the only French student, and everybody else was Chinese.
Oh,
And that
okay.
was in France, in my school in France.
Yeah.
And I think I wrote about that in one of my posts. I said, the first time I worked with Chinese people, I talked the entire time, and they agreed to everything I said, and none of my ideas made into the final work, right?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And this was my first. That was my first experience to be exposed to a culture that is so radically different, right? But because I had that experience, for me, going to that class was also part of exploring something so different, like this these differences in communication. Even though I didn't understand them, I didn't know how to deal with them, I was just mesmerized by this. I just couldn't get enough. And so after, when I finished I graduated from business school. I didn't look for a job. I
Mhm.
just, put whatever money I had in the bank, and I bought myself a ticket to China, and I went to China for 6 months, and it
Mhm.
ended up being almost 5 years, which led me to Singapore, where I've been for the past 14, 15 years now.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent story because listening to how you grew up,
Yeah.
and experiencing just one culture, especially in small town, and how you've been able to expand and, like you said, have that culture shock. I mean, you know, a lot of us, especially in smaller cities, especially in North America or anywhere in the world per se,
Yeah.
they experience this, and they navigate those situations much differently. Either, like you said, they backtrack and they say they can't handle it, then they just, they go back to their roots, or they experience it, especially as a young person. And that's something that we should cherish, especially as young people, because our minds are just, we have so much to learn and so much to gather and to learn
Mm,
from other people, especially. And,
mm,
and that whole power distance thing, especially your situation that you mentioned
mm,
with the Chinese students, where they were, nodding and stuff. And that's, of course, that's that cultural difference of, because of the fact that you're coming in as an expert, right? So that's something
mm.
that we need to flesh out a little more, and I want to get into that a little more through our
Yeah.
conversation. So like we said at the outset, your expertise is in cultural intelligence,
Yes.
and that it includes a keen understanding of language competence, and it's been
Yes.
a recurring theme within your research. So tell everyone, in the audience here that are still learning about the need for cultural intelligence. Why is this relationship important, especially in the global workplaces?
So, you mean the relationship with language and
Yeah,
cultural
language. Yeah,
intelligence, right?
yeah,
Yes. Okay.
yeah.
So, when I was thinking of, when I went to do my PhD, I had to think of a topic, what is something that about cultural intelligence that interests me. And one thing I had noticed from when I went to England and then to China is that I always saw myself as a culturally intelligent person. I didn't know what cultural intelligence was. I did not have a term for it, but
Mhm.
I could sense that for me it was not very difficult to communicate with different people. I could observe some differences. I thought, I could take perspective. I could adapt, right? But one thing I had realized was that when I was doing this, so when I was into England and at the time I didn't speak English so well, and then later on I went to China and I also didn't speak Chinese. It took me a long time to learn how to speak Chinese. I felt that I was a different person. So the fact that I couldn't speak the language very well limited me in my ability to relate to other people, not just in terms of how I can, just simple things like talking, right? But how I can, um, uh, like you have less flexibility because when you a language is the tool that you use to show the world who you are, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And so, but who you are is very complex and is
Yeah,
multifaceted. And
yeah.
so in order for you to show truly who you are, you need to have that mastery of a language that allow you to communicate the nuances in depth.
Mhm.
Like, if you want to, if you think yourself as a funny person, you need to be able to make jokes that make people laugh. Because if you
Yeah.
don't, then am I still a funny person, right? But when you are doing this in a language that is not your main language, that you are not fully confident or competent to speak, then you are very, very limited in that. And so that also limits your ability to use your cultural intelligence to get to the results that you want. Because first of all, you cannot understand fully what other people are telling you. So in terms of
Mhm,
cross-cultural learning, you are limited to your own interpretation of what you hear and see. But a lot of the things that we learn through language.
mhm,
And then you are also limited in your ability to express. So in the model of cultural intelligence, there is knowledge, what you know about other cultures. There is, your strategy, which is how you learn and absorb and adapt to the nuances of the culture. And the last one is the action. The action is how you feed back to others. How do you change your communication, your nonverbal, to be more adapted and appropriate in the other culture. And a lot of it is in the language, just the language, the words that you use, the sentences that how you structure them. So my idea was that it's okay to be culturally intelligent. We can train people to develop their cultural intelligence, but if at the end of the day they don't speak the language, or they are so limited by the language, then teaching them cultural intelligence is pointless because they won't be able to use it. So in our research, we look at the comparison, how the two work together. And one thing
Yeah.
that we found, which I found was very interesting. I mean, we found several things. So the first thing is, it doesn't, when you get to a certain level, because we work with university students, people who were quite competent in their life, it's not a matter of competence anymore. It's a matter of confidence.
Right.
So you can be very competent in the language, you pass all the tests and all of this, but because you have this self-belief that my English is not good, that
Hmm.
limits largely your ability to connect with others. And the second thing that we found is that it's not just language. I mean, it's not just language competence that matter, but even for people who are very fluent in English, like native speakers, or people who now, like even like me, who can speak without really thinking, right? Um, having good language skills does not guarantee that you will function effectively in a multicultural environment. You need to have that cultural intelligence. And the way
Hmm.
cultural intelligence operates is, I say, it's like, one of them is by, when you're culturally intelligent, you want to build more connections with people.
Yeah. Hmm.
And one of them is that if you are working with people, for example, what in my research, what we found is when you have this combination of high language confidence and high cultural intelligence, then you try to connect with people beyond work. Like maybe you
Yeah.
have work meetings and things you have to do that you cannot avoid doing. But in a work life, you also have all this space, where you can, that is a lot more flexible. Like
Hmm.
imagine, even if we have to do a Zoom call, like you and I, we had to do a Zoom call before
Yeah.
to set up for this. You have different ways to do it. You can go straight down to the work and say, okay, here is how this is going to go. Here are the questions, the timing, and the this and the that, like very task based, right? But you can
Yeah.
also choose to spend like 5, 10, 15 minutes even to chit chat. It's like, okay, how's the weather where you live, and your kids and your family and your hobby and this and that, right? And that time that you spend building that connections, right? Whether it's on a Zoom call at the beginning, or whether it's, in the office when you meet people, you go out, you invite them to go to lunch with you or to
Hmm.
hang out after work. These soft, interactions, they,
Hmm.
they they create something, and they add to the psychological safety in a cross-cultural relationship later on when you have to work together. And this
Yeah.
is really important because, especially in a multicultural teams, multicultural context, there's a lot of apprehension. Like people are not sure about each other, and so when you don't know someone from your culture, let's say, like you are a stranger and your distance is like this and you have to bridge that distance, right? But when you come
Hmm.
from different cultures, for some people, the distance they perceive with a stranger, it can be as far as this. You start from even further away. And if you don't have those moments, those small moments of connection, you stay like that. The problem
Yeah.
is when you have to work with people and you are this far away, because you continue to see each other as strangers,
Hmm.
you find it harder to when you have questions, when you have problems, you don't want to bring it up. And so speaking up, voicing concern, all these things, I think that people do less, and this ultimately affect the functioning of the team. And this is why in a multicultural context, especially when language is potentially a challenge, it's really important to be very intentional in building this relationship so that people can create the psychological safety,
Hmm.
that exists when relationships are closer, when strangers become like,
Yeah.
colleagues that trust each other. Then it also change the way we relate to one another in the context of work. And why this is important for employees or multinationals, I think it's because, I mean, I see it, in Southeast Asia. Typically, expatriates will receive some kind of cross-cultural training.
Yeah.
Uh, Multinational companies are going to recruit people who speak English, but
Hmm.
the perception, the English competence, and again, it's not just the competence, it's the confidence. Uh, there are huge, huge variations. And generally, one thing I have found is for multinational companies, the local teams don't receive a lot of cross-cultural training. The cross-cultural training is for the expat who come from elsewhere. But the local team, imagine you are leading a team in Indonesia. And in Indonesia, you are expat manager. So you will get some kind of training about how to do business in Indonesia and things like that. But what about your local team? And Indonesia is a country where there are huge variation. Like some people speak perfect English and others, and so you cannot know what's in their mind. And so this combination is important. It has implication for relationships and, generally the outcome and the functioning of teams.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And, as I'm listening to what you're saying, one of the things that come to mind, and you may have slightly mentioned it, is that a lot of this work, a couple of things come to mind. Number one is we've seen for probably the past 6 or so years, inclusive leadership. They talk about courage, collaboration, etc. But the one thing they mention is cultural intelligence, and yet not a lot of people know about this. And as you were talking about multinationals and multicultural work settings, we have the multinational companies, and then you have the local companies. So what I want to ask you is, what if someone comes to you as someone who works for a local organization that has no international presence per se?
Yes.
What would you tell them to say that, hey, you need to have cultural intelligence within your organization? Because you did mention psychological safety, etc. But when you get pushback or some skepticism beyond that, what would you say to someone like that who wants to build their soft skills and or has some questions about it?
I think it's a very tough one.
Yeah.
Because I know that people who work in the space of DEI are not bringing in cultural intelligence, and there's this whole discussion that culture is not just about nationality. Culture is about your gender, your race, your age group, but at the same time, I found that what I can say already is research doesn't go at that level, of nuance, but the research that has compared the importance of cultural intelligence in leading multicultural teams or culturally diverse in terms of nationality groups versus groups that are homogeneous, of the same nationality, clearly tells us that CQ, cultural intelligence, makes a difference in terms of leadership effectiveness in the international group. Its effect is almost non-existent in the national group. In the national group, what matters more is emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And I think that's where things are tricky, right? Is because fundamentally, cultural intelligence has an additional dimension of cultural knowledge. When, I'm French, I live in Asia, clearly these are very different cultures, and you can see it and you can describe it. And the gap, because they are so big, then that's where cultural intelligence really make a difference. When you are within the same national context, it's more difficult to observe these differences. You can still see some systematic differences. Clearly people who are in the accounting and finance department, have different preoccupation from the R&D team and the marketing. Okay, that we get it. But it's like, but then I feel like, it's just a bit more challenging to push this idea of cultural intelligence. The way I would see it is, cultural intelligence is a framework that can help us as trainers, even if you are in diversity space, even if you only do this within your own national context. I think the value of cultural intelligence is to provide a framework to structure your interventions. So I see it more as a tool for trainers and coaches and consultants to structure their interventions than as a product that you want to sell to a client and convince them that they need it. You can still use it. You don't have to tell them. Right. And actually as a tool for consulting and training is really powerful because it
Mhm.
gives you a roadmap. It's like, let's start with that, motivation. Like, are people interested in, connecting with each other? I think that part, and you can build programs and design intervention that really push people out of their comfort zone and build their capability in the 4 dimensions of the model, which is like the motivation to engage with people who are different, the knowledge
Mhm.
about each other. You don't have to tell them, oh yeah, people from this group are like this and people from that group are like that. All you have to do is give them a baseline and say, okay, how would you define the way people work in that team? How would you define the way
Yeah.
people work in that other team? I know that Erin Mayer, the culture map, she's using some of this for this kind of conversation.
Right.
Um, so I think this is very powerful. We are not trying to box people into, okay, your culture is like, but it's more like
Right.
using cultural words as a mean to start conversations to get to know each other better. And then
Yeah.
then you can talk about how, we talk our unconscious bias, like affinity bias or um, um, like confirmation bias or all these
Right.
things. So then you move the discussion that initially was around culture, but people don't see it. So they don't see why do we need culture into a conversation that is more about, okay, maybe it's around creating more psychological safety. Maybe it's about like more inclusive, having more inclusive conversation. You call it however
Yeah.
you want. That the counterpart can understand, but you still use this, this cultural intelligence framework as a mean to provide a solution.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense because, this is something that I was always curious about, especially, working in the EDI space
Yeah,
where a lot of people are focused on the local solutions and, divvying it up by, like you said, race, sex, gender,
mm,
etc. And yes, those are important, but what are those cultural interactions? How do they
yeah,
relate? Because especially as we talk so much about intersectionality, right?
yes,
Because they all integrate one way or another,
yeah,
and especially when culture is prevalent in how people decide on their interactions and stuff. And that's a thing. And as you mentioned before, one of the things when we first started talking, not only just online, but when we introduced each other
yeah,
online, before deciding to go with this podcast, is like, how do you build those relationships from the outset? Because I've never been that type of person who's been down to business kind of thing. And I know there's other cultures that do that.
that's
But at
right.
the same
Yeah,
time, it's how do you build those relationships so that you gain that trust? And that's something that a lot of people are still trying to figure out, especially whether you're in that EDI space or within or as a leader, right?
mm,
When you're trying to gain that trust of your employees, etc. And especially from someone who's coming from a new country, refugee or not, or just a new immigrant from the country, they have different experiences and they're just navigating the country, they're navigating their experiences, etc. So how do you embrace them? And I think, and from what you're saying, that's exactly how we do it, and that's how leaders should be able to embrace that. And as consultants, this is what we try to tell them
yeah,
as part of that framework, to build those relationships within an organization. So
right.
that was something that was fascinating, and I really appreciated your insight into that very, very much. So now let's shift it a little bit, and the one of the things that we spoke about a lot, was the one thing that really got my attention. Excuse me, was the fact that we talked about the cross cultural dating aspect of it, right?
Oh yeah,
And and then that was the fun part because our conversation was about you know how I navigated different relationships from different cultures, and that's how I got interested in cultural intelligence and not
yeah,
even knowing the name of it, right? So, but you, on the other hand, you have a separate podcast, where you
yes,
talk, where it's, as I mentioned at the outset, CQ and love. So
yeah,
so, as you mentioned about your relationships in the beginning of your journey into this space, what, um, what are your instances when it comes to that cross cultural dating, and how does CQ get involved or is involved in that kind of atmosphere? So that's the fun part of all this.
Well, I when it comes to okay, I'm not an expert in cross-cultural dating. I want to clear that.
Oh, I know that, but you have a podcast, right? So I mean,
Yeah, I
you
do.
know,
So the podcast is not really about dating; it's about
right? Yeah, relationships. Yeah,
relationships. So we start from dating, but then we go into different stages of the relationship, right? And I tell a lot of my personal stories.
right.
But I think like a funny anecdote around cross cultural dating and culture that also gave me a lot of insights. Like made me more aware of these cultural differences and how they work.
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
that I like to say that when I lived in China, I went on many dates. I didn't know they were dates.
yeah,
Maybe many is a big word. Maybe it's like several, a couple. But the thing is, dating practices, is something that like we take for granted. Like the way you get close to someone and all of this. But at the same time, we don't realize that it's very, very cultural. And so
yeah,
when I went to China, I was 23 years old. So of course I was single. So of course, I was going to date people because this is the age when you meet people and like you also look for a partner. And because I so is but I was in a different cultural context. So I have two instances in particular. The first one
yeah,
was that I was an English teacher at one point. I was my English was never so great, but some people wanted to learn English with me.
yeah,
And one of them was this Chinese businessman. And so I was offering my English services. So I had a book, I had prepared a lesson plan and everything. And so he came to my house for a lesson, and he arrives, and I'm ready to start. Like get down to work. You want to learn English? I'm going to teach you. I have a lesson plan and everything. And then he sits down and he opened his laptop and he showed me this big presentation about how he has a PhD and he owns a company and it's some kind of like big industrial furnace type of, like those huge oven, like super high temperature oven, kind of like a factory. And
yeah,
I mean, honestly, I don't care. I just want to get down to my lesson, right? You here, he's
yeah,
paying me
yeah,
money for that, for my time.
yeah,
And he just talked about this. And then after talking about giving me his whole, business presentation, in the end, okay, fine, we get to the lesson. And then the lesson ends, and then he leaves. And then, okay, I see you next week. So the following week, he comes back, and this time he arrives, and he has a bottle of perfume for me. And so he gives me the perfume, and I look at it and say, "Thank you very much. Very nice, not to give to your English teacher." I take the perfume, put on the side, and then let's get down to the lesson.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then at the end of the lesson, he tells me, "Okay, next time you come to my office, I will send my driver. I have a driver. I have a big house. You come to my office." And I thought,
Yeah.
okay, that's pretty nice. The guy wants to drive me around. Now, at the time, I already had a boyfriend. That was my now husband. And he was not in China at the time. He was studying abroad. And so we were separated for a while. And so after that after that second lesson, I called him and I said, "Hey, there's this guy and I had this lesson and he gave me perfume." And my husband tells me, "Oh, but he's trying to date you." And I was so clueless, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But the funny thing is, it's not that it didn't happen one time. Then 2 or 3 weeks later, I got a call from a colleague and
yeah,
he invites me to hang out with him and his roommates. And I go to this apartment in the outskirts of Beijing and it's like 5 guys living together, like they just graduated from college. You can imagine the kind of like, it's a boy apartment and it's not very nice and it's very old. And I mean, this was still, China 20 years ago. So the bathroom is still, the shower is literally on top of the toilet and everything.
yeah,
And then we hang out there and then, we go out to dinner and then we come back and then we watch this movie together. He wanted to show me this movie and his friends are there. And then at the end, I just leave, right? And my husband, again, I called my boyfriend. I said, "Oh, yeah, I went to hang out with those guys, he said, Catherine, this is China. A young girl, like a one girl doesn't go hang out with a boy just like that. This is a date. He wants to
Yeah.
date you. Because in China, typically when people are interested in each other, they're supposed to, I was supposed to bring my girlfriends. You know, that if I were
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
follow the
Yeah.
standard protocol, I would have brought girlfriends and we would have all gone. But for me, coming from France, it's okay. You know, like cross gender to hang out together. We don't have to want to date or anything. It's okay to want to
Yeah.
be friends.
Yeah.
So I that's where I started thinking, okay, this concept of dating, even the word dating in France, we don't have a word for
Yeah.
dating. It's not the way that we see it in American movies or TV shows. I learned about dating in Friends. You know, there is this episode where I think I forgot which character, maybe it's Chandler and Monica have to decide,
Yeah.
or Ross and Rachel, I don't know, have to
Yeah.
decide
Yeah.
what is the status of their relationship. And to me,
Right.
it's so strange, right? Hey, you kiss each other, you are in a relationship. It's a committed relationship from that moment. Even if it lasts 5 minutes, you are in a
Yeah.
relationship. But
Yeah.
this idea of dating, so that was my my learning about the cultural differences. But
Yeah.
not just about the cultural differences. So that's the knowledge part, right? You learn that the practices are different, but it's also an insight into my own mind, because I realized that even if I knew it was different, I still go and I don't realize that what are the intention of the other person, until after the fact, right? So after that incident, and then later on, this guy, he sent me flower, and I mean, the day he sent me flower, it was pretty clear. I went to my Chinese friend and I said, okay, tell me what to do, because I, I don't want to break. I mean, of course, I'm going to break his heart, but I don't know the proper way of, making this clear. Again, this is a culture when things are not necessarily done very directly. I'm French. We like to say things in people's face, especially if it's not, like, I mean, French people can be quite direct.
Yeah.
And in China, this doesn't, for me, many times I try and that didn't come across so well. So it was
Yeah.
also my chance at practicing this element of cultural intelligence that we call the strategy. Is, okay, now that you know that the culture is different, how do you respond to it in a way that is culturally appropriate, right? What do you do with it? And for me, my solution was to go to my girlfriend and say, okay, guide me, because, I, I, I don't know how to manage this. Yeah.
Oh my God, that's a fascinating story, and you know, but now now the differences, and of course you're now with your husband, so you don't have to worry so much about that. But it's an
No.
interesting, it's an interesting dynamic and of how you both navigate situations, and I think that's critical, whether it's in the workplace or in dating, right? I mean, you don't really think of it in a dating perspective, but when you look at it from a scientific perspective per se, that's it all makes sense, right? So coming full circle with everything that you've talked about, what would you say as your key takeaways in terms of cultural intelligence for not only global EDI practitioners but also business leaders regarding this framework?
My key takeaway. I mean, one idea that I'm starting to, I'm grappling with lately is this idea that, um, cultural intelligence is a competence. It's something that, I mean, when researchers went into studying cultural intelligence, the question that was driving their inquiry was, why is it that some people are really good at adapting to any cultures and other people struggle, right? Why are very competent people, in their country, when they are thrown into another country, or into a multicultural team, suddenly they stumble versus others who thrive, right?
Right.
So that's cultural intelligence as a competence. Clearly, for leaders, research is unequivocal. It makes a
Mhm.
difference, right? Having
Right.
developing those skills the way they are. I mean, we always talk about these four quality: the motivation, the knowledge, the strategy, and the behavioral flexibility. these four quality combined uh, make you more effective at adapting to other cultures. But one thing that I'm starting to recognize now, because I teach, I mean, I do executive education workshops. I teach managers. One thing I'm starting to realize is that many people actually already have cultural intelligence. They just don't know it,
Yeah.
but they have it,
Mm-hmm.
and so when we go in and we want to train people, I feel like we often go with this assumption now, let me tell you how to be culturally intelligent. But I think now more and more a better approach is not that, is to say, hey, you already are and you don't know that, and I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
help you turn your experience, your intuition, into something that you can that you can use to replicate your success in a more conscious way. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
just about developing skills, but it's actually translating something that is unconscious into something that
Right.
is very conscious. So I feel like it brings back to this idea of bringing awareness, but awareness at a much deeper level, the level that you have, that you already have it in you. Of
Yeah.
course, not everybody, but many people do. And when we come in, as DI leaders, as cultural intelligence trainers, we can we come here to deliver tools that help people, that empower people to use the thing they themselves have learned through their experience, their observation, their intuition, into something very concrete that help them, like I said, replicate success, like know exactly what is it that they are doing that is making them successful, and
Mm-hmm.
teach others and inspire others to do it. And
Yeah.
I feel like this is, I it's like some, I call that like moving from CQ as a competence to CQ leadership. It's like we can
Yeah.
be culturally intelligent leader, like DEI leaders. It's not about convincing others to come our side. Is actually recognizing that they are already on our side, and what we have to do is to elevate them to the next level so that they themselves can become advocates.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating because we hear, I've never heard the term CQ leadership. I mean, we talk how it's embedded, CQ is embedded in inclusive leadership, but
Yeah,
that listening to what you're saying in terms of that CQ leadership and unlocking that unknown that people have is something that can be cherished. When you're building those relationships and becoming a more culturally aware leader, if you will, and that
yeah,
and that's something that's fascinating to know.
yeah.
And so in closing, I just want to ask you a couple of
Okay.
fun questions
Yeah.
to relax it all, and so what is the one thing that if someone were to come to you and say, Catherine, tell me something that we don't